So from these two perspectives, what we could say is that they argue that collective action itself is something that results in the formation of groups, that this in itself is a conscious act and is about countering experiences of marginalisation, of segregation, of disempowerment, and really about coming together to effect some kind of change in particular populations. I think it's important to foreground this with a point that connects this up to the context of migration. The creation of groups is directly related to a set of social conditions and a growing realisation, as we'll come to see amongst migrants generally, about the common predicaments in which they find themselves and which have the potential to unite them. So moving beyond the unifying factor being their immigration status, but actually around a set of causes and issues. And we'll explore some of this now in this next section. The first point to acknowledge is the global migration context and changes since the mid-1990s. So far in this course, we explored questions about how, where, why people move. And this has been located in another level of analysis, looking at economic, political and legal structures and understanding migration flows and experiences. We then shifted our focus to look at the everyday. But against this background, we can see, particularly across the West, this is occurring within a context of an endless succession of changing rules and increasingly hostile contexts of reception. And the case studies you're going to be looking at later will explore some of this. We've seen increases in the number of people claiming asylum in the UK. What's different here is that the conditions people find themselves in have led to the emergence of different forms of associationism. So not just in response to needs to express their own conditions and customs and traditions, as has formerly been the approach in line with the race relations model, but looking at a response to an institutional repertoire of political systems that are exclusionary and regressive and punitive, for that matter, commonly referred to as the conditions of reception. And you've explored some of this in the UK in particular. For example, there is enforced dispersal, removal of the right to work, welfare supplied by vouchers or cashless credit, welfare support at 70% of the low income support and is not risen in line with inflation, changes in visa regulations in relation to work and family and study. And this affects not just people claiming asylum, but other migrants as well, sans-papiers and undocumented workers, or people who are documented but exploited. And relatedly, this has led to increased ambiguities associated with differing immigration status and concomitant rights and entitlements, the emergence of and reliance upon formal and informal networks, the associations of transmitting information and cultural codes. So these are some of the changes in the migration context globally, locally and nationally. We've seen collective mobilisations punctuated by public events to defend collective identities and offer points of view on settlement experiences. So the associations and collective mobilisation itself are sites and practices of what could be defined as integration and protest. And this really refers back to this tension between compliance and defiance that Scott highlights. Relatedly, there's a focus on the development of protest via associations as networks, as a refusal of those involved to be seen as people from nowhere. Particularly this is in Catherine Kiminal's work. So by asserting themselves, what migrants find is that collective mobilisation is a way of raising visibility, but at the risk of reprisal. This then increases the spatial politics of resistance. And the final point here is about the increasing visibility of women migrants globally, and as a result, a growing place occupied by women in migrant activism. Alongside an increasing feminisation of asylum migration, one of the noted features of contemporary migration is its feminisation, although there's some debate about the extent to which this is pointing to something new or a continuity of migration since the 60s. But what is clear is that women now make up a significant proportion of the migrant populations within Europe. And in relation to asylum, the feminisation of asylum migration can be linked to a growing recognition at international level of the existence of gender-related forms of persecution, which hadn't previously been considered as coming within the remit of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. So how do we connect this up to migrant activism? And I think that Daytona and Maria provide a really thoughtful and helpful way of thinking of activism and agency in nuanced ways, proposing first of all a broader definition or understanding of activism, as we can see in this quote. This encompasses what might be understood as traditional political civic agency, as well as other forms of grassroots activism, so classical political activism about rights and anti-racism work, but also those activities that are about setting up initiatives and projects about meeting the everyday needs of migrant communities. So they see any definition of activism as one that must really encompass a wide range of actions and forms of work, expanding the range of areas usually covered. These are tangible, often happening in real time, in a particular place, or they can be virtual. So here again, encompassing forms of digital activism. But what should be clear is that there are direct parallels with some of Sivanandan's critical race approach. And we can map this out onto his conceptual framing of communities of resistance who organise around shared issues and troubles, and which in many respects trouble themselves, those binaries between us and them, between migrant and minority, between refugee and migrant worker, and so forth. So the first important point here about how we might understand migrant-led activism is really relating to the terms we use. In media, political and everyday discourse, we know that some migrants are constructed quite simply as more migrant than others. And I don't think these binaries are helpful and often are more limiting. So thinking critically means we have to question the construction of the object of analysis. And by this I mean, what exactly are we trying to say when we speak about migrant or migrant-led activism? So there should be caution in how we use terms that could be interpreted as sweeping generalizations. There is, of course, diversity within groups, and this has to be identified to avoid talking about groups as rigid entities. And we need to be attentive to fluid social dynamics that govern and shape alliances and communities. And we also need to attend to the ways in which social identities intersect with each other all of the time. Majigensi talks about the sexism inherent in the sans-papier movement that she helps to set up. Activism is fueled by multiple identities and social positions, and these social positions also force people into different identities, so there's a multi-layered aspect to it that can lead to frustration felt by those categorised in certain ways. Daytona Moreo suggests using the term migrant or migrant-led as a reference to a standpoint which manifests itself against the practical everyday implications of migrant policies. And I think if we extend our conceptualisation of activism to move beyond visibly and audibly demarcated actions, so that it does include everyday actions and strategies for survival, then we can begin to explore and better understand acts that are specifically intended to counter experiences of marginalisation and disempowerment. And conceptualised in this way, activism as acts to affect change can be as much about the everyday as they can about wider social change. And there are some implications for this reframing, which is that it marks a shift towards experience-based activism. We often hear about experts by knowledge, experts by experience, where the condition of being the migrant becomes the very grounds for marginalisation and the source of knowledge and expertise to develop a set of resources to challenge this marginalisation. And so in thinking around some of this, we could say that there are some key characteristics around migrant-led protest, activism and resistance. First of all, we look at risk. There are a series of risks and tensions that unfold from political strategies of visibility and representation, and this happens in very material ways. Becoming visible and demanding rights exposes migrants certain migrants to the full force of state border controls. Hence, for many migrants, making themselves visible through protest is an activity engaged in only as a last resort. As Imogen Tyler documents in her account of the naked protest undertaken by mothers in Yarlswood Detention Centre, some of those who took part in that process were disciplined and penalised by having their deportations fast-tracked. So in this sense, visibility is about part of those technologies for policing migrational flows. Another key characteristic here is solidarity, and increasingly this is about acting beyond the individuals directly affected, informed by a practice of mutuality and respect, and, as Sivanandan would argue, organising and mobilising around issues and causes transcending one variable of difference or division, but rather focusing on the effects of marginalisation, segregation, exclusion on others similarly marginalised or excluded. The quote here is from an article that's going to be one of the case studies, and the point here is that if we don't fight ourselves, then we're just going to create greater borders for others. And then finally, visibility and audibility. So this question of being visible, being heard, the punishing effects of visibility, as we've seen, lead to risk. But the practices of migrant activists, and the example here of the sans-papiers, reveal that becoming perceptible is also a strategy of resistance. Making migrant experiences visible and audible is often the overarching aim of immigrant protests. And Madjid Cissé makes this very clear. We are here, and we have been here a long time. So these three characteristics, I think, are ones that we can identify in much of the protest work we're looking at and how protest and resistance comes to be theorised. Okay, and I'd like to take a pause now and for you to watch the following short clips. They've been posted on the Padlet, so you can see here on the Padlet for the course. So you would just need to scroll down to find these and scroll along. It's just minimised for the purposes of demonstration. But I'd like you to watch these clips and reflect on some of these questions of representation, of voice, of power, challenging dominant narratives about who the migrant might be, what the migrant is able to do, and how we redefine understandings of activism. And really, some of these reflect the everydayness of these experiences and their organic development, so these organic communities of resistance, and how we might connect this to what is happening to the theoretical and conceptual debates. I'd like to watch these clips and bring your notes to class and think about these when you're looking at the readings and going back to the readings and consider some of those questions that we've explored thus far.